we're going to explore triads in more complex harmonies. So there are 4 basic triads, and triads are chords that stack thirds. They can be spelled out by stacking thirds. Other structures that use 3 notes, some theoreticians use the term trichord. I learned that as a graduate student with Professor Weinberg. He would talk about how people like Dalla Piccola and Schoenberg and Webern and Berg, Alban Berg, they would write 12-tone music, and they would break up their tone rows into 4 groups of 3. And they would arrange them so that each of those groups, when you played them as a simultaneity, they would create a chordal structure, not based on thirds a lot of times. It could be something like, right, that's a 3-note structure. That's C, D flat, and G. Another 3-note structure could be something like, right, or that could be a 3-note structure. Typically, once you start getting into these kinds of structures, they are incomplete extended harmony chords. So, for example, that first one, right? If I were to stack that up in a way that could possibly be considered triads, I have 2 options. I can I could take the C and jump it up an octave, and then I would get this, right? So that's D flat, G, and C. And if I put an E flat in the bass, right, I've got an E flat 13 chord. Or if I take that and I drop the G down, and I put an A in the bass, that's some sort of A7 sharp 9. I mean, I can do the same thing up here, right? So it's some sort, or if I take this structure, D, E flat, and G, and I transpose the bottom note up an octave, right? That could be an E flat major 7th. That could be a C minor 7th, right? That could be an A flat major 7th with a raised 11th. So those 3-note structures are typically some sort of an incomplete extended harmony. So that's this 7th chord. They're fragments of chords, right? Now, there's one other chord called the suspended chord, which is basically a 5th, and then from the bottom note up, you take the 3rd, the G, the C, and you move it up a half step. And you play that as a simultaneity, and you get a suspended 4th. Typically, a suspended chord is prepared. So let me just see for a second. So if I do something like this, right? And it's typically on the 5 chord in traditional harmony. So I went C, A minor, F, and I got F, move the top note down, then I've got F, A, C, F, A, C, F, and then I keep the C when I play that G chord, and then resolve it down to its 3rd. So a suspended chord it's a triad, but it's something that's usually arrived at through some sort of voice leading and counterpoint. Typically, although in popular music, in more recent times, it's a structure in its own right. And additionally, if you open up that spacing, you get a 4th chord. So in other words, you take the bottom 2 notes, the top note, and drop it down an octave, you get G, C, and F. And then that becomes, with additional notes on the bottom, that becomes a really nice jazzy kind of chord voicing. So the suspended 4th. All of you should be able to play all of this in every key on a keyboard. Major triads in all inversions, right? You know, an inversion is when you take the bottom note and transpose it up an octave. And you should be able to do that with all of those 4 food groups. When I was 19 years old, I took a bunch of lessons from Jackie Byard, who was a really great jazz pianist. He played with Charles Mingus, and then he taught. I believe he started the jazz program at New England Conservatory, but he lived in Hollis, and then I guess he would be living up in Boston for 3 days and then come back and down to his house in Hollis, Queens. I used to go to his house and work with him, and he had me. First lesson was like, come back in a month, work on this, and all it was just learning triads, just like what I've written here. And I didn't understand at the time how beneficial that was. The next thing you can do is you can start learning how to harmonize scales using your triads. And so if you take a major scale, and that's this one here, C major scale, and just play it in parallel. I mean, I can do that every key, no problem. I'm in F sharp now. I'm in E flat. And then the same thing with the inversion. So the first inversion, second inversion, and then you make up games. You play games where you play around like here. I'm going to go in fourth. So I'm going to go from C to F just by moving the top two notes in the scale up a step. So I go from C, E, G up to C, F, A. I should probably get that piano keyboard up here. Where is that? Right. Then you're in the scale. You go down to the next chord, B, and then top two notes up a step. And then you do the same thing with minor, melodic minor, which is right here. And then in melodic minor, you come up with a couple of really interesting chord voicings. So you've got diminished, got your augmented there. I'm going to play this first chord right here. So that's a C major 13th with the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th. It is basically every note in the key of C played at the same time. Right? I've got C right here, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Right? So they alternate the scales between the hands. So C, E, G, B in the left hand, D, F, A, C in the right hand. And if I take the right hand and drop it down an octave, you can see on the keyboard there, I've got all 8 notes, all 7 notes of the scale. Interstitially, inside of this extended harmony, are all of these triads live in there. If we start on C and play the first, right? Start on the E, we've got an E minor chord, we've got a G chord, we've got a B diminished chord, a D, and then F. Everything but the A minor exists. Basically, extended chords are stacked triads. That's the first concept to get to your head. Most great harmony can be achieved with 3 and 4 notes at a time. You can play you can play big chords like that. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes, right? 7 notes. You can do that, but you can also do right, just 4 notes and have some beautiful textures that you can then relate to what you're writing. Because one of the concepts of composing music is that if you're writing a score, every different food group of instruments, so let's say you're writing an orchestral score, right? You have basically 4 large food groups. You've got the wind, the brass, the percussion, and the strings. The percussion can be broken up into 2 groups, drums and cymbals, right? And pitched percussion like marimbas, xylophones, piano, harp, celeste, orchestra bells, glockenspiel, stuff like that. If you think about each of those 4 food groups as its own individual choir, each section should sound good on its own, and all the sections should sound good in different combinations. So in other words, if you play the strings and the flutes, that should sound really good. If you play the flute and the brass, that should sound good. If you play the brass and the pitched percussion, that should sound good. If you play the brass and the strings, that should sound good. They all should work together to create the sound you want. Sometimes that means that they work in opposition, even if they're working together, right? Because the sound you want might be very off-putting and dissonant. Let's go back to the 4-note concept here. And so in the right hand here, I have an E minor chord, the first one. The second chord is an F. The third is a B flat. The fourth is an E flat. This one here is a C flat or a B major triad. This one here is an E flat triad, and then an F triad and an E minor triad. So let me make that a little smaller so it's all one line fits on the page here. So I'm going to play the top line here. So this is just major and minor triads up top. So then in the left hand, I've got C, B flat, E flat, A flat, A flat, E flat, G, C. So when we put the 2 of those together, we get something that sounds interesting. One more time. What we have here is a combination of complete chords and incomplete chords. What do I mean by that? The first chord is C, G, B, and E. Now, if you don't know what chord that is, what you do is you stack up the thirds, right? So in close positions. That means that there's no other tones between that. So it would be C, E, G, and B, which is a C triad with a major 7th. So that's the first chord, or E minor over C. The second chord is F over B flat. And if we stack that up in thirds, B flat, F, A, and C, we're missing the D. So it's an incomplete major 9th chord. And because there's no third in that, it has an interesting timbre. Because you could, let's say you were playing this, if I added a B flat in my left hand, you have a really, really spicy chord, right? If you added a D natural, a D flat, I mean. So you have B flat and D flat. Really spicy harmony, right? If you raise this tone up a whole step, half step, okay, then the next chord, that's B flat over E flat. So it's the same type of chord as this, but it's the top part is a different inversion. The B flat's in root position. Here, the F was in first inversion. So this is an incomplete major 9th chord. And the same with this. This is the same chord as this, just down a whole step. Right? So it's an A flat, it's E flat over A flat, an incomplete major 9th chord. Now, right here we get to something different, right? It's a C flat triad over an A flat. Now, if we put that into thirds, we have to take the top 2 notes and transpose them down an octave, and we get something like this. Right? An A flat minor 7th chord. So we can go from and that, notice the nice voice leading here. I've got the G, B flat, and E flat, and I take the bottom two notes, and I wedge them out. So the G goes to G flat, and the B goes up a half step. And then we keep the E flat on top. It's a common tone between the two chords. And then on the next chord, we have a D flat triad with an E flat in the bass. So if we stack that up in thirds, well, it is. It's this E flat, D flat, F, and A flat. So it's an 11 chord because this is an 11th. The A flat's an 11th above the E flat, but it doesn't have a major or a minor. Like if you made that E flat, G, B flat, D flat, F, and A flat, if you filled all that in, that chord's not good. Right? So if you wanted to have, you're in a major key and you wanted to play a chord like this, you would leave the third out. And so what does sound good, though, is the minor third, the E flat to G flat. That sounds beautiful. But this is just a E flat over D flat. And then the next chord right here is the same quality as this chord, but the right hand is a different inversion. So this, again, is in first inversion, going to root position in the right hand. So it's an F over G. So that's a G11 chord, without the third in it. Now, notice the voice leading here, right? This time the common tone is on the bottom. You have an F. So what's happening is that from this chord to this chord, the bottom two notes wedged out, right? They went from these two pitches to those two pitches. So you could see on the keyboard, the top one goes up and the bottom one goes down. Notes. From here to here, you've got the opposite action. So your thumb note is common between the two, the F, and then the top two notes fold in. So that's good voice leading. And then the last note is the chord is the same as the first chord. We just did major and minor chords on that top example. So now if we want to add some of our diminished triads. Now a diminished triad is derived from two areas. It's if you're in the key of C and you take a G7 chord, which is the 5 chord, right? It's the top, right? You remove the bass note. What's left is a diminished triad. So a seventh chord a dominant seventh chord contains a diminished triad. It's also a triad based on the 7th degree of a major scale. And that it has two minor thirds stacked on top of each other. So B to D is a minor third, and D to F is a minor third, right? Now, the outer shell is called a tritone, right? Because it's got 3 whole steps. So C to C sharp to D sharp, and D sharp or E flat to F, right? A tritone like this wants to resolve in. Remember we have those wedge? It wants to resolve in. If we invert that tritone and put it up here, it wants to wedge out in the key. We've got a couple of these are diminished chords, and let me just play through this and then we'll talk about it. One more time. Okay, so in the left hand, I'm doing something called a pedal point, which is all of these Ds stay the same while we change the chords above it. Pedal point came from ancient times, when church service, right? When the organ player would hold one note down with his foot on the pedal board and then play chords above that. That's where it originated, I believe. So what am I doing above that? Well, if I look here and I just talk what chords these are, the first chord is a C diminished, C, E flat, and G flat. And now to a G minor. And if we notice here, the G flat and the C resolves out to the G, the B flat and the G. So the C goes down to B flat and the F sharp or the G flat goes up to G natural. And then now we've got an A sharp or a B flat diminished triad. I didn't write B flat because there's no B flat in the D chord. Well, there can be, but it's in this instance it's an A sharp, which is the fifth of the chord raised up a half step. So anyway, we've got B sharp, C sharp, and E. Again, that nice resolution where the tritone goes out. Then we've got a G sharp diminished triad to a C minor. And then now we've got the diminished triad. We've got a D sharp diminished triad in first inversion. So a D sharp diminished triad is D sharp, F sharp, and A. I've taken that D sharp and I've transposed it up an octave. So, and again, my tritone, let's see. Yeah, my tritone is here and it resolves in. So if I play just the top line, and then with the bass, right? You get like your instant Bach. Okay, like a Bach prelude. Now let's do our augmented triad. So an augmented triad is two major thirds stacked. So a diminished is two minor thirds. Augmented is two major thirds. An augmented chord is typically found in minor on the 5 chord. So in other words, if I'm in the key of C minor, and I could go to the 5 chord, G7, right? If I keep that E flat in the top, right? It's like a suspension almost. I have my G augmented 7th chord. So that's where it's derived from. You lose the 7th and you're left with those 3 notes. So it's 2 major thirds, C to E and E to G sharp. So let me play the right hand. Now, you notice that with these augmented triads, they don't sound stable, right? They are very unsettled. There's no resting on them. The same thing with the diminished triads, but the diminished triads feel like they're moving to a place. Augmented triads are a little bit more difficult to deal with. Okay, let me add the bass line. You see how you can make some really crazy dissonant stuff, right? And that could be part of like a really eerie mood. A lot of this stuff is experimentation. So what I have done is, I've spent time just playing around, like, okay, so I've got a C triad. What happens if I put a B flat in the bass? Oh, I like that. And that has to resolve out like that to an F chord with an A in the bass. So what happens if I put an A in that? Okay, that's just an A minor seventh. What if I put an A flat there? Okay, that's cool. That's an A flat major seventh if I stack it in thirds with an augmented fifth. The G is in the chord. What happens if I put an F sharp in there? Really, yeah, Stevie Wonder used that chord in a pop tune, believe it or not, that Dizzy Gillespie's playing on. So a lot of it is experimentation and keeping a diary. Like just get a piece of paper or, I don't know, a piece of manuscript paper, or just even if you write out the note names like on a regular piece of paper, that you could go back later and you could keep like a chord diary. It's just a matter of experimentation. So like if I wanted to fool around with some of this stuff, and I thought that like, let me play C minor to F minor. Very easy in the right hand, right? Let me add some other bass notes and see what I can come up with. So let's start off with, and I want to make this very dissonant, okay? So I've got D flat, C minor over D flat. And then, right? Right, and you could just write these things out and just create your own sounds. So let's look at a few more examples of this. Right now, this is really nice, right? Because remember, I was playing these the bass note a fifth lower than the chord. So in other words, I was playing F over B flat, but there was space between the B flat and the triad. In the first chord here, it's a C over G, but the C is a step below the lowest note in the right hand. So the right hand is a G triad in second inversion. I love that. Right, just simple 4-note structures, triads, and other notes, right? And this is something that, I figured out in a few minutes. So what is that? So that's G over C, F over B flat, E flat over F. This is a really spicy chord coming up. E over F. That's a really beautiful chord. That's an incomplete D flat 7 sharp 9 or G7 flat G13 flat 9. Okay, and then the next chord is F sharp over E. Right, and that's an F sharp 7 chord in the third inversion. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so here's the third version. You take that bottom note here and then this one here is interesting because this is a D minor chord over E flat. Now, that's an incomplete 13th chord because we put an F in the bass. Right? It's an F13 chord, but you don't need to have all the notes in there. You just have the pitches you need. Let's take a look at this little example here. right? You see, I'm not playing anything. Remember, I've talked about simple but not simplistic, right? You could cite any competent musician could sight read this, what I'm playing here. Yet it evokes mood and feeling, and it's harmonically interesting. And it's just really, learning your triads and adding a fourth note and experimenting around to see what you can come up with. So B flat over F, F over B flat, I'm sorry, B flat over E flat, A flat over E flat over A flat. Now this next one is an F diminished triad over G. Right, that in the Doobie Brothers song. Okay, so, and then D flat over G flat, and then A augmented over B, and then A minor over B flat. That's a nice sound.